In this lecture, we stay with hunter-gatherers, but we move away from the desert and to the coast, to the Santa Barbara area and the Channel Islands to look at the Chumash culture. We will see how hunter-gatherers in environments with reliable, productive, and predictable resources can begin to have emergent social complexity with some social differentiation. The Channel Islands region is along the coast west of Los Angeles from the Malibu area to San Luis Obispo. Santa Barbara is in the center of this, and this area along the coast and in the adjacent Channel Islands was occupied prehistorically and historically by the Chumash peoples. Some areas on the islands have very steep shores that could not be approached with boats from the ocean, and these areas remain unoccupied. But where there were broad open beaches that allowed people to approach from the ocean via boats, these islands had intensive human occupation, beginning perhaps as early as Paleo-Indian period. The Channel Islands region was occupied by the Chumash Indians at the time of European contact, and archaeology suggests cultural continuity from these historic occupants back into prehistory. While Chumash villages were occupied for generation after generation, they built fairly insubstantial structures that did not leave many archaeological remains. Here we see some reconstructions of Chumash houses at a park in the Malibu area. A series of saplings would be set into the ground and then bent together to form a dome, which was then covered with woven mats of grass. The only archaeological remains that would remain behind from these structures would be the post holes and remains of the hearths that were inside, the areas where fires for cooking and heating and light. More substantial archaeological remains are found in what archaeologists call midden deposits. These are the areas where people repeatedly dumped their trash. In this photo, we can see a dark band of soil exposed in this cut bank. And this dark band of soil represents the deposits of organic materials, charcoal, ash, leftover remains of food, as well as bones and shell and broken artifacts, which are all the white things that are found within this dark layer. But these midden deposits are often stratified from bottom to top, with the earliest deposits at the bottom and the latest deposits on the top that allow archaeologists to look at change over time. Changes in the types of artifacts used, changes in the types of foods consumed. And since these favorable locations that you could approach from the ocean were occupied for generation after generation, many Chumash sites have substantial midden deposits. The archaeology of the region suggests a nearly continuous, unbroken occupation by a single cultural group, perhaps going back as far as 8000 BC. This initial period is also called the milling stone horizon because of the typical stone tools that were used for processing grass and sage seeds. They gathered shellfish but did little hunting or fishing. During the following early period, fishing became a more mainstay of the diet, but gathering acorns and hunting deer were some of the primary means of subsistence. During the middle period, there was intensified fishing and increased hunting of sea mammals. We also see increased warfare that may have been caused by periodic droughts. And towards the end of the middle period, we begin to see the emergence of wealth-based status differentiation, the emergence of Chumash chiefdoms. Now, the transition between the middle and late period was generally characterized by decreasing residential mobility as people began to settle in villages in specific ecotones on the coast, inland, out on the islands, and exchange between these different areas. This exchange increased in the late period, and we began to see the emergence of a shell bead currency in order to mediate exchange relations between these different areas. The kelp forests that were mentioned in relation to the early coastal adaptation of Pleistocene immigrants to the New World were also very important for the Chumash. Here we see one at the surface of the water, and it doesn't look as impressive as it does under the water. These kelp forests were very productive marine ecosystems, with many small and medium-sized fish, various shellfish as well. And being located close to the shore, they were easily exploited. Abalone were some of the most important shellfish that were consumed. These are large snails that are about 8 inches in diameter, and the whole bottom underneath this shell is the giant foot of this snail-like creature. And it provides a substantial amount of meat for each animal that would be harvested. Now, these animals are not found in the shallows right next to the coast, but rather people would have had to go out into the kelp forests and dive to retrieve them. The interior of the abalone shell is very iridescent, and the shell was used to make shell jewelry, but it was also used to make an important item for subsistence. Fish hooks were made from abalone shell. Now, these hooks were not baited when they were put into the water to catch fish. Rather, the hooks themselves were like lures, and the shiny, iridescent abalone material would catch and reflect light and attract the attention of predatory fish, who would come thinking that it might be a distressed small fish and swallow it, and then get the hook caught in their mouth. You'll also notice these hooks don't have holes to allow the attachment of a string. Rather, you can see some with a series of notches, others with little studs that stick out, but there are no holes to secure the line to them. Here is a hook with some fishing line that was woven from eelgrass, and you still may be wondering, how exactly did they attach these lines to the hooks? They tied them on, and then they sealed the tie with asphaltum, which is a type of very sticky tar. The Santa Barbara region is a major oil producer in the modern day, and prehistorically, before people were drilling offshore oil wells, oil would seep onto the seabed, coalesce into tar balls that then would wash ashore, where they could be collected and used for purposes like gluing fish hooks onto line. And we'll see some other purposes that Chumash people put asphaltum to as well. The Chumash manufactured 2 types of boats. The first was what is called a balsa, which is made by bundling tule reeds together. Tule, T-U-L-E, is a plant very similar to cattails, and here you see it growing in the background, and you also see a boat that was manufactured by bundling the reeds together in order to make a canoe-shaped float. Now, these could carry 1, maybe 2 people, and they were most useful for using close to shore, because in heavy seas with lots of waves they could get swamped, waterlogged, and lose their buoyancy. So balsas were not particularly good for taking journeys all the way out to the Channel Islands. You would have to go under ideal conditions with seas that are light without waves in order to not risk capsizing or losing the buoyancy of your vessel. But they were very useful for close-to-shore activities like fishing for small or medium-sized fish in the kelp forests or diving for abalone. The other type of boat that the Chumash made was the tomal. This is a very sophisticated composite piece of watercraft that was manufactured beginning perhaps in the middle period into the late period. And the reading that you have by Arnold and Bernard assesses the evidence that is used to identify when tomals were introduced. Here we see the last member of the Chumash Boat-Making Guild, the elderly gentleman with a beard on the far right, who is directing some workers from the Southwest Museum in Pasadena in the construction of a tomal. This Chumash boat builder was hired by an anthropologist at the museum to reproduce some of these vessels to have for the museum's collections. Tomals are what are called sewn plank canoes. redwood planks are sewn together with ropes. And since redwood does not grow in the Santa Barbara area, the Chumash had to collect it as driftwood that had come down the coast from up north where redwoods do grow. These pieces of redwood would be shaped into planks, and then holes would be drilled into them adjacent to each other as they're arranged to make the boat, and then rope would be drawn through these holes to tie them together. The joints between the planks as well as the holes that the ropes go through would then be caulked with asphaltum. And this creates a large vessel, considering they could only find small pieces of wood. It also produces a vessel that is slightly flexible, which it gives it some advantages when operating in heavy seas. And a tomal could carry up to 4 people plus cargo, which was considerably more than could be carried in one of the balsas. This allowed for increasing amounts of travel and exchange of resources between populations living in the Channel Islands and those living on the coast and inland. So what is the archaeological evidence that Arnold and Bernard present for the construction and use of tomals? Using deep stratified midden deposits at several sites in the Santa Barbara region, they look at the appearance of specialized tools and materials that were used in the construction of tomals. Macro drills, large drills used to drill the holes in order to tie the planks together. Asphaltum applicators, specialized pieces of stone, sort of wedge-shaped, used to force the asphaltum into the joints between the planks of redwood, as well as the materials, redwood and asphaltum. And by identifying when in the stratigraphic record these types of tools and materials arrive, they suggest that that's when we can see the introduction of tomal construction. They also look at another line of evidence of the use of tomals. When do we start seeing pelagic fish species found in middens? Now, pelagic fish are large fish that live way out in the open ocean. And in order to catch them, you need to go out of sight of land, well out beyond the Channel Islands. And this was something that could not be done in a balsa and could only be done in a tomal. So the presence of bones from these fish suggests that people were traveling in tomals way out into the ocean, catching these fish and returning to consume them on shore. Tomals also increased the amount of trade that occurred between the Channel Islands, the coastal populations, and those in the interior, as they could move more people and products between the mainland and the islands. It also increased the flow of information and communication between these populations, further integrating them and stimulating the production of resources in the different environmental zones in order to exchange them between these populations. This map shows some of the tomal routes that were used to trade and travel between different communities. As you can see, they generally tried to hug along the shore and tried to use the shortest distances between the mainland and the islands. And even at these shortest distances, it's between 12 and 25 miles that they would have to paddle across the ocean to get to the Channel Islands. But this would be much easier in a tomal than it would have been earlier in a balsa. In order to facilitate exchange between these different environmental zones, the islands, the coast, and the inlands, a form of currency emerged, shell bead money. And we know that this was used by money because of observations made by early Spanish explorers and missionaries who interacted with the Chumash. We also know that the production of shell bead money was controlled. It's not as though anyone could grab a shell and sit down and start busting out their own currency. Shell bead money could only be manufactured by specialized craftsmen who were attached to and listened to the orders of the chiefs. So the chiefs controlled the production and distribution of money. The shell bead money was made from a fairly common variety of shell, olivella, which refers to olive, and these shells are about the size of a small olive. These are small snail shells that are relatively easily found on the coast in the Santa Barbara region, and you can see in these diagrams how different types of beads could be cut out from different areas. The beads, as well as the planks to manufacture the canoes, were drilled using a bow drill. In a bow drill, the shaft has a bowstring wrapped around it, and then by moving the bow back and forth, it rotates the shaft. On the right, we have a diagram showing the shaft with the bowstring, the material it is drilling into, and on the top there is a piece of wood that has a divot in it that the end of the shaft rests in and can rotate in, and the person can press down while moving the bow back and forth in order to force the bit down into the hole. On the right we see an actual bow drill, and it has a clamshell filled with asphaltum down towards the end near the bit in order to provide more weight and centripetal force as you are spinning it with the bow. These are micro drills, very small drills. You can see the scale. Each of these is not much larger than 1 centimeter long. Some of them even shorter than 1 centimeter. You can see the small pointy end that would be used in order to drill a hole in the shell. These are made out of chert, a material that is used in manufacturing flake stone. And it is hard, and it can have sharp edges, but it's not going to drill very effectively if you don't introduce an abrasive that would be rubbed between the bit and the material that you are drilling a hole in. So they would add fine sand that would be worked into the hole, and it would act as an abrasive, wearing away the material in between the rotating bit and the material being drilled. Macro drills, which were used for drilling wood, were much larger but very similar in general shape and principle. In addition to increasing opportunities for trade between the Channel Islands, coastal populations, and populations living on the interior, the introduction of tamales also increased opportunities for open ocean fishing, the ability to go way out into the ocean to catch very large fish. And this was also an important factor in the emergence of Chumash chiefdoms. They're going miles offshore in pursuit of broad-billed swordfish, a fish that could be up to 15 feet long and weigh as much as 1,600 pounds. And here we can see one on the left that's been hooked and is leaping out of the water trying to shake the hook from its mouth. Modern fishermen spend hours fighting these fish using rods and reels. But Chumash fishermen just had hand lines, and part of the strategy would be, once the animal is hooked, just to let it tow your boat around and wear itself out until it was so exhausted it would float at the surface of the water, and you could pull it in and stab it with a spear. Then you would have to paddle like mad to get it back to shore before the dead, bleeding fish attracted sharks. If any of you have read Hemingway's book, The Old Man and the Sea, it's about an old Cuban guy who goes out and with a hand line catches a huge marlin. But then as he's rowing home after several days of fighting this marlin and bringing it finally alongside his boat, before he can get back with the marlin, sharks eat the whole thing. Related to the swordfish is the black marlin, which is also up to 15 feet long and 1,600 pounds. These billfish were very important in Chumash mythology, and they were considered to be the equivalents of humans out in the ocean, the top of the food pyramid, the most powerful beings of the sea. In addition to billfish, they also fished for tuna. Bluefin tuna can be up to 10 feet long and weigh 900 pounds. You see bluefin on the left. Yellowfin, which we see on the right, can be up to 8 feet long and 450 pounds, and they can leap remarkably out of the water. And why are they leaping out of the water? The one on the bottom, you can see, has another fish in its mouth. It is a flying fish that tuna had leapt out of the water in order to grab out of the air. These were amazing fish. Huge fish that would have been very difficult to catch and land and bring back to shore. While most likely intending to try to catch billfish, they would also occasionally catch sharks, particularly mako sharks and blue sharks. Mako sharks are up to 15 feet long and 1,800 pounds. Blue sharks a little bit smaller, but still very large. Now we're talking about fish that are almost as big as the boats that these guys are going out into the ocean to pursue them in. This is very challenging, and it demonstrates a lot of strength and bravery to be able to accomplish this task. So what is the importance of these pelagic fish species in Chumash social evolution? Why is catching these fish important in the emergence of Chumash chiefdoms? These large fish provided abundant high-value food. Hundreds of pounds of very high-value fish. I don't know how many of you have ever eaten swordfish or tuna steaks, but these are very high-quality fish. And in the warm areas of coastal California, Southern California, they could not be effectively preserved. So when one landed, hundreds if not 1,000 or more pounds of high-value fish meat, it needed to be distributed and consumed relatively quickly. And this allowed the owner of the catch, the guy who caught the fish, he and his crew who risked their lives going miles offshore, fought for hours against this giant fish and then brought it back. It would allow these owners of the catch in order to establish social obligations and debts with those who received the gifts of food from them. It also demonstrated the fishermen's strength and bravery. It was an opportunity to achieve social status. And it wasn't just that you were strong and brave, but you had gone out and challenged the swordfish, the oceanic counterpart to humans. Now, Tomal ownership increased access to these resources. If you had a Tomal, you could go out and fish for these and create social debts and obligations and demonstrate your personal qualities of strength and bravery. And you had access to this avenue to prestige. So Tomals were important because they provided access to these high-value fish species and allowed the owner of the Tomal to have access to an abundant food resource that they could distribute to create social debts and obligations. It was also a means for individuals to demonstrate their strength and bravery, which were highly valued traits. It provided opportunities for trade. There was greater volume of trade between the mainland and the Channel Islands, exchange of marine and terrestrial resources, and movement of people and information. And being able to involve yourself in these activities would give you an advantage in your own local community, having greater access to materials from other ecotones and having connections in those areas. Now, the ownership and construction knowledge needed to make Tomals was restricted. This allowed for the emergence of social inequality. Once the advantages of Tomals were recognized, those who had Tomals wanted to restrict the ability of those who did not to get them. So they created a guild that kept the specialized knowledge of how to build them restricted. And Tomals could only be owned by people of high social class. And so this created sort of a positive feedback loop. If you needed one of these Tomals in order to create social prestige and renown, you had to already be a member of the upper class. And if you were a member of the upper class, you were able to maintain this position of power and authority by limiting the ability of those below you to have access to the same resources that allowed you to gain your prestige. While marine resources were key to the Chumash economy, various terrestrial resources were also important. And inland from the coast you have grasslands and chaparral, which is a mix of pine, oak, and juniper. And the Chumash and interior villages traded resources that they collected in these terrestrial ecosystems for marine resources from the coast and from the islands. These resources included deer and the various products that were produced from deer, not just meat, but also their hides. Tools could be manufactured from antlers and bone. Their connective tissue, the sinew, could be used to manufacture threads and even bowstrings. The hooves could be boiled down to glue. There are many products that can be created from deer other than just the meat. Acorns were an incredibly important wild plant food. Here we see a blue oak, which is the largest and most productive of the oak trees growing in the Chumash region. The inner meat of acorns is edible. You have to split off that outer shell to expose the softer nut meat within. Acorns will be put into these bedrock mortars, depressions that have been ground out of the stone in order to allow another stone, a pestle, an upright cylindrical stone, to be used to work up and down and crush the materials that were placed within. So you would crush up the acorns, sort out the shell from the nut meat, but the nut meat then couldn't be immediately consumed. The nut meat of most acorns is very bitter because of the tannic acid that is contained within them. So this would require the meal that had been created by grinding up the nut meat to be leached prior to consumption. So here a Hoopa Indian woman, another California Indian tribe, and many California Indian tribes used a lot of acorns. Here she is pouring hot water through acorn meal that has been placed in a specially prepared bowl-shaped sand-lined depression. So the hot water goes through the acorn meal, the hot water removes the tannic acid, and then the water containing the tannic acid percolates down through the sand below, leaving only the acorn meal behind. And you would keep pouring hot water through until the acorn meal stopped tasting bitter and started tasting sweet. So what to remember? You should remember what a tamal is and how they were made. There are these ocean-going canoes made of redwood planks sewn together and caulked with asphaltum. Some of the archaeological evidence that has been used to identify tamal manufacture and use includes the tools and materials used for their manufacture and the bones of pelagic fish species that could only have been obtained by using tamals. Ownership of a tamal provided a pathway to power through control of the proceeds of the catch, as well as the ability to participate in trade between mainland and the islands. Restrictions were placed on tamal ownership and manufacture and was used by Chumash chiefs to solidify their hold on power. Trade between communities for terrestrial and marine resources led to specialized production by communities with access to different resources and the development of a shell bead currency as a standardized form of exchange.